Hello, and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today, I want to have a look at a statement that was put out by the National Police Federation. Now, if you're wondering who this is the union of rank-and-file RCMP members. So, they're not a small group, they're not an insignificant group. This is a statement that matters. It's not from some sort of randos. And let's have a look here. So, this is the Gun Violence and Public Safety in Canada position statement. This is in relation to the recent order in council banning a whole bunch of firearms. Now, I'm going to go through some of this, sort of the key bits. It's not very long, but I'm going to offer some of my own commentary as we go. So they note that they support an evidence-based approach to advancing public safety and the prevention of gun violence in Canada. Evidence-based approach is one of these sort of buzzwords that's rapidly becoming meaningless because everybody says evidence-based approach, and most of the people who say it don't really have a whole lot of grasp on the evidence or don't care about the evidence. But let's have a look at what the National Police Federation have to say, because this one I think you'll like a little better than most. So background, they say that illegal guns and shootings are on the rise. I'm not actually sure because violent crime generally has been trending downwards, but I'll keep an open mind here. I'll have to check and see if there's been an uptick at the end, but moving on. They note that Canada shares the world's largest undefended border with the world's largest manufacturer of small arms, the United States, and that 2,242 illegally sold guns used in crimes in Canada were traced back to manufacturers in the United States. We'll come back to this. They also note that 22 people lost their lives in a tragic event, I'm avoiding certain language for YouTube reasons, in which all firearms used were illegally obtained. Of the 4 firearms used, 3 were obtained illegally from the United States, and they leave out where the 4th was obtained because it was obtained from the police in the course of events. But they note the gunman did not have a possession and acquisition firearms license, making his possession of any firearm illegal. He was effectively subject to the broadest possible ban, which is a ban on everything. Canada reported 678 homicides in 2019, 261 of which were firearm-related fatal shootings. Homicides, including shootings, gradually increased in Canada between 2013 and 2017. Notably, city centers such as Toronto are experiencing dramatic increases in firearms-related homicides. Now, let's stop and think about that, because when you think about where PAL holders are concentrated, they're typically there's more of them in rural areas rather than city centers. That seems strange if we're thinking that PAL owners are the cause of this. Homicides linked to organized crime or gangs have also risen. In 2015, 16% of homicide victims were linked to organized crime or gangs, and this number rose to its second highest rate, 24% in 2019. In addition, in 2014, 52% of all shooting homicides were linked to organized crime or gangs. Finally, almost 1 in 4 total homicides were related to gang activity in 2019. Now, I suspect if you broadened this and, didn't just look at organized crime or gangs, but also looked at sort of disorganized crime, specifically people whose occupation, whose sort of, when you say, what do you do for a living, whose most honest answer would be, I engage in crime, I think those numbers would be much higher. Typically, that's what we see. So in the last decade, handguns have been the primary firearm used in gun-related homicides. So I don't like this part here because they're throwing sort of handguns under the bus. And most PAL holders, who have handguns are using them for target shooting and so forth. Not most, the vast majority. So in 2019, over 60% of the 261 homicides committed with a firearm involved a handgun. These firearms are either already prohibited or restricted in Canada, illustrating the issue of the complexity of illegal firearms usage. Again, when we're talking about people whose occupation tends to be moving and dealing in contraband, the fact that something is contraband does not tend to pose a great obstacle to them. Saying, oh, this is banned, so they can't get it. Well, if you're talking about drug dealers, literally everything they do is in relation to banned substances. The 2020 assault or assault-style firearms ban does not alter the status of handguns in Canada. In fact, assault or assault style is not a legal weapons classification in Canada. They are colloquial terms to describe high-power and rapid-fire guns, often used by the military, that are mostly already banned in Canada. And in fact, when they're talking about, because assault weapon or assault rifle properly describes a select fire rifle, i.e. one that has a full auto or burst fire capability. Those are banned. There's a few grandfathered holders, but they're not engaged in crime. Most of them at this point are getting advanced in years because you can't get a new grandfathering for those classifications. Now they note that the RCMP plays an integral role in preventing gun violence. That's accurate, but of course they're going to talk themselves up here because they are the RCMP, alongside other agencies such as the CBSA and municipal police forces, etc. So, challenges. These are things where they're saying that essentially the pain points are in terms of dealing with this. Now, I'm not sure that I agree entirely with the cause, but in terms of steps to take, they take some good approaches here. So they note, the Canadian Firearms Program is responsible for the administration of the Firearms Act, however, does not have the resources to provide effective gun crime tracing and enforcement units. If you're thinking about why they don't, well, amongst other things, because they're having to handle, every transfer that we make, ATT requests, all sorts of things that just eat up their time and maybe aren't helping deal with actual criminals because the rate of crime amongst licensed gun owners is very low. And they note the Canadian National Firearms Tracing Centre processes tracing requests for national and international law enforcement agencies. However, the center does not collect statistics on illegal guns. Rather, it determines the history of a gun connected to a criminal investigation and uses that information as potential evidence in court. Further, there is no legal requirement for police to submit firearms for tracing. So what this means is that every time you see those stats about where firearms are sourced or traced from, they're mostly BS. And the reason why I say that is that most guns don't get sent off for tracing. They're only going to send them off for tracing if there's some reason for that. They don't have unlimited money. And so they're not going to engage in tracing most of the time. So when we see things like, whatever percentage of firearms were traced domestically or internationally, well, first, it's a lot easier to trace a firearm that was originated domestically, because if it came here on a ship, then that's pretty much where your investigation is likely to end. Arrived from ship. That's it. But domestically, you might be able to track it to, some original origin point. The other thing is they're more likely to send certain firearms for tracing than they are for others. So whatever, however that weighs in, it's going to distort the statistics here. This is them pointing to the fact that we don't really have good statistics. And so that's important for us to know and important for the public to know, because the public sees numbers like this and they think they mean something, and they really don't, other than just, we have some bad stats. So costly and current legislation, such as the Order in Council prohibiting various firearms and the proposed buyback program by the federal government targeted at legal firearm owners, does not address these current and emerging themes or urgent threats to public safety. Fairly strong language. They're saying, this doesn't help anything. And they specifically note some things. It also does not address criminal activity, illegal firearms proliferation, gang crime, illegal guns crossing the border, or the criminal use of firearms. And when you think about the things that matter in terms of, stopping gun crime on the streets, all of these things are much higher priority than, going after Olympic target shooters or people who compete in 3-gun. They note as well, in fact, it diverts extremely important personnel, resources, and funding away from addressing the more immediate and growing threat of criminal use of illegal firearms. The RCMP is saying, we have limited money, we have limited people, we have limited time. Why are you making us chase every AR-15 owner when instead we could be going after gangs. Wouldn't you rather we go after gangs rather than trying to do this? I don't think they're wrong here. This makes sense to me. So they note about police agency bodies, including National Weapons Enforcement Support Team, which is NWEST. You'll see them mentioned all over the place. Canadian National Firearms Tracing Center, Criminal Firearms Strategic and Operational Support Services, and the Specialized Firearms Support Service. That's a lot of organizations, all for sort of the same idea. You'd think that they would try to sort of lump these together and maybe get some efficiency out of that, but I don't know. I'm not in operations. I can't comment too much. But they note that this is support to responsive enforcement instead of proactive investigation. So the RCMP here is saying that they would like to do more proactive investigation of gun sources, of, gangs, border issues, that sort of thing. Again, makes sense. So they call for funds to be allocated to the RCMP Border Integrity Program to enable dedicated proactive RCMP investigation, weapons enforcement activity, and the dismantling of gang and organized crime firearms smuggling. Because, many of these gangs or substantial organized crime have basically built pipelines for how they get guns into the country. They have organized methods, and the police need to detect them. Of course, as they get good at detecting one method, organized crime is going to move on to another method. But, that seems like a good place to dedicate a fair bit of effort. They also call for funding that enables law enforcement to properly address crime prevention rather than towards the ongoing monitoring of unrelated restrictions on licensed and regulated firearm owners. This again makes a whole lot of sense. Think of how much money is spent on ATT requests, for people who, thankfully, and this was the Conservatives that did it, but frankly, this one should have been a no-brainer. The Liberals promised that they would get rid of it, and then I think have realized that would have been dumb, and so they kept it. But the automatic authorizations to transport to go to the ranges, that just makes sense, and it saves a huge amount of money. Why would you want to have people processing authorization to transport requests for every range trip? But similarly, people need to take things to, various places, and it's a headache. It costs a whole bunch of money. So the RCMP is saying, please let us spend our money more intelligently. Let us go after crime and criminals instead of, the ordinary law-abiding gun owner who, for the most part, are fairly boring in terms of what you find in investigations. They also note that they support evidence-based policy changes regarding licensing, mandatory safety training, safe storage, and registry of civilian firearms that meet Canada's high standards for legal firearm ownership. I don't really know about the registry for civilian firearms, and I say that because when we look at the firearms registry, one of the things that came up with the abolition of the long gun registry was that they were being sort of consistently challenged to provide some evidence that the registry was working. And the best case that was trotted out in the media as, now we've got a case, the registry has solved a crime, and it was of a guy in a small town who robbed a bank and left the firearm behind, and they were able to trace that firearm and determine that it belonged to the guy's dad, and thus they were able to find out who he was. Except what they left out on that story in a lot of the reports, and later was sort of made a little bit more clear, is that this was a small town, and he robbed the bank with no mask, and several people literally recognized him. Hey, that's Jimmy. His dad is so-and-so. Here's where he lives, because small town. And so they already knew where, who he was. Finding the gun and tracing it back to him was just sort of an additional piece of evidence. But they were going to get a conviction just on the basis of, yeah, I was robbed and I recognize the guy and it's Jimmy. So, not exactly a strong bit of evidence here. Again, evidence-based sort of is one of these buzzwords that's rapidly becoming meaningless, particularly because a lot of the research that's done in this field, and this is by both sides of the issue, but people set out to do research to prove, either that guns are bad and need to be banned, or guns are great and everyone should, carry 3. And that's not really how science should be done. You shouldn't be doing science to prove a point. You should be doing science to discover information. So where we have these sort of research labs that have explicitly that they want to do science to prove a point, that's not really very convincing. And a lot of the research that comes out of those is super sketchy, and in ways that sort of are right on that incompetence versus malice kind of break point, where you just can't tell if they're doing it by accident or on purpose. So I'm always concerned by the sort of evidence-based buzzword, but I hope there's some hope for that. But so what we see here, and I'm going to be a little bit cynical here because some of the things here I think are worth being a little cynical about. The RCMP union here is calling for more funding for the RCMP, which is not surprising, but that's sort of what unions often do here, and especially what police unions do. But they're also calling to be able to move their funding to places that are more useful. And to my mind, there's, I can't find fault with them saying, let's move the funding. There may be a cynical motive for saying we need some additional funding. The other thing that they don't mention, but I think is worth sort of considering here, is that the RCMP gets issued patrol carbines that are either AR-15 variants or very similar to them. And so there's a fair number of police officers who, in their civilian capacities, because a police officer goes home, puts their hat on the shelf and is a civilian in their daily life, but they own AR-15s for the purpose of training and practicing, because frankly, the RCMP's budget for target practice is terrible. They don't get a whole lot of range time. I have shot more rounds in one range trip than many RCMP officers get, for training in an entire year. One range trip. So sometimes you have diligent police officers who go and, want to train on their off hours with their own private firearms. That makes sense to me. It's in everybody's interest that the RCMP should be able to shoot straight, because every bullet fired, and if they have to fire bullets, you want them on target, because every bullet that is fired lands somewhere. So ideally, you want it landing where they were shooting so that they, A, need to take fewer shots, and B, so that those bullets aren't landing somewhere that you don't want them to be. Like, say, a fire hall. I'm sorry, I had to, but yeah. So they don't mention it in this, but there's a lot of police members out there who are kind of upset that they're going to be losing that capacity to train in their off hours. And frankly, I agree with them. But I also don't see any reason why they should be limited to the RCMP. The number of homicides using AR-15s in Canada is exceedingly low. Very low. So, anyway, that's sort of my review of this particular, sort of policy statement. I think on balance, it's a good policy statement. It's not entirely sort of pro-gun owner. It's recognizing that PAL holders are not typically a threat to society, which is, good. It's sensible. But they're not sort of coming out swinging on our behalf in a huge way. They're just saying, we recognize this. We would like to spend our money elsewhere, please. Fair ball. And, they are being a little bit self-serving, but not to a degree that I think invalidates the message. I don't think, this is just sensible. I hope our politicians listen to it. I doubt they will, because that's just not how they roll, but I doubt they will. At any rate, thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, want to see more of it. I want to thank my Patreon supporters. I'm going to leave a link to my Patreon, but also to the press statement here so that you can read it in its entirety if you want. So thank you to Patreon supporters at the $50 level, George, Demo, and People of Canada. At the $30 level, Steve Browning. And at the $20 level, Dale Nesbitt. And give me a second here because this is going to be a bit of a speech. Also to $10 Patreon supporters, My Buddy Keith, Process Eng, and Stephen Larson, Mark D, General Counsel of the CCFR, John Robinson, Tim Rogers, Roy Haddock, Fracklesdack, Jean-Alexandre Tessier, Cameron Johnson, Sir Goat, Sights and Arms Limited, Chaba Hollow, Peter H, Craig Kwan, Akin Coxall, North Central Process Service, Toys Are for Boys, Ian Vaughn, Milan Vrakic, Terrence Griffiths, Doug Thompson, Brad Crooker, Jason Harrington, Lee Kiso, Mark Stout, Rochelle Stotzel, Scott Sweetman, Mike Rhodes, Alvaro Bataille, DF, Stacey Cartmel, Tactical Advantage TV Canada, Ian S., Dave Leslie, Juan, Donald Duncan, Stephen Conquest, Darren Duell, Sean Crane, Ian Hutchinson, Rory, Travis, and Kevin Fleet. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge. In an upcoming video soon, I would have done it today, except this is sort of breaking news and I wanted to cover it. But I want to talk about some important legal changes that are happening in Alberta that I think a lot of you are going to potentially get upset about. They're kind of a big deal. So thank you for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge.